Welcome to Life Stories, where every moment holds the potential for change. Today, we bring you a heartwarming tale of unexpected connections, trust, and the power of honesty. What happens when a simple act of kindness on a bus leads to something more? Follow the journey of Sophie and Ethan as they navigate love, deception, and the quest for authenticity in a world full of expectations. Their story will make you believe that sometimes the most meaningful relationships start with the smallest gestures. Subscribe to the channel to begin this beautiful story today. It was one of those days. The kind where your body aches from the strain of juggling school, work, and everything in between. Yet you keep pushing through because what else is there to do? The November wind bit through my thin jacket, a constant reminder that winter was coming. And yet, I still couldn't afford a proper coat. I shivered, pulling my hoodie tighter around me as I trudged toward the bus stop, mentally preparing for the day ahead. The day had already been long. 3 morning classes at the university, each one dragging on as the hours blurred together. And then my 8-hour shift at Brood Awakening, the local coffee shop that I worked at to help pay my half of the rent. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep a roof over my head and helped with some of my mom's medical bills. She had health issues that made it hard for her to work full-time. So it was just the two of us trying to make ends meet. I stepped onto the bus, exhausted, my mind already wandering to the exam I had the next day. I scanned my monthly pass and flashed a smile at the driver, who gave me nothing more than a grunt in return. I slumped into a seat near the back, my forehead resting against the cool window. The city lights blurred together outside, the night slowly swallowing the day. My body was aching, but my thoughts were miles away, lost in the worries about my mom and whether she'd remembered to take her medication. It was at that moment I heard a voice. Wait. The bus doors creaked open again, the driver clearly irritated at having to stop again. A young man stumbled on board, slightly out of breath, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans. He looked like he had stepped out of a fashion magazine, effortlessly chic despite his understated clothes. His dark hair was windswept, and there was something about the way he carried himself, confident, but not cocky, that caught my attention. That'll be $3.50. The driver said flatly. The young man patted his pockets, his face turning red with embarrassment. He looked almost panicked, fumbling for his wallet, but after a moment, his shoulders sagged. I'm sorry, I think I left my wallet at home, he muttered, his voice trailing off, humiliation painting his features. The driver didn't seem moved by his discomfort. No money, no ride, he stated bluntly, pointing toward the door. I watched the exchange from my seat. I could see the embarrassment on his face, the sense of being utterly stuck. I knew that feeling all too well. The helplessness that comes with not being able to do something as simple as paying for a bus ride. Without thinking, I stood up and walked to the front of the bus. I fumbled through my pocket for the loose change I'd received as tips from earlier. $3 and some odd change, enough to cover the bus fare. At least, I handed it to him without a second thought. Here, I said, my voice quiet but clear, as I extended my hand toward him. I've got it. For a moment, the young man looked at me in disbelief. His eyes, a warm shade of hazel, widened in surprise, and I could tell he was about to refuse. But instead, he nodded gratefully. Thank you, he said, his voice earnest. I'll pay you back somehow. I shook my head, offering him a tired smile. Don't worry about it, I said, before turning back to return to my seat. He found a spot a few rows ahead of me, occasionally glancing back at me, though I was too lost in my thoughts to notice. I was already thinking about the exam, wondering if I had enough time to study before I had to be back at work the next morning. I didn't give him much more thought, though I couldn't deny there was something about him that stuck with me, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. Like he had never expected someone to do something kind for him without wanting anything in return. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that I had just helped Ryan Matthews. His family owned the Matthews Grand Hotels, a luxury chain that spanned across the globe. He was an heir to a billion-dollar empire. And yet, there he was, struggling to make it onto a bus without the means to pay. That moment, as small as it seemed, would be the catalyst for something that neither of us could have anticipated. Ryan watched me from a few rows ahead, his gaze lingering longer than I realized. He had never known someone who saw him for who he was beneath the title, beneath the wealth. For a fleeting moment, I wasn't just another person looking at him through the lens of his family's name or the money in his bank account. I was just someone who saw a person in need, someone who could empathize with the feeling of being stranded, even if only for a moment. That was when I felt it too, this strange, unspoken connection. It was the kind of bond that isn't based on shared history or shared circumstances, but on a moment of shared humanity. He nodded at me once more, and I could see it in his eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement. A silent thank you. Then, as the bus rumbled forward, our worlds drifted apart again. But neither of us would forget that brief intersection of our lives. The next morning, the coffee shop was buzzing with its usual early morning rush. The line of caffeine-hungry customers seemed endless, each one more desperate than the last for their daily fix. I had just finished steaming a batch of milk when I heard a familiar voice. "Grande caramel latte with almond milk." The voice called out, just as the steam hissed from the espresso machine. I looked up without thinking. There he was, the same young man from the bus. For a moment, I stood frozen, surprised. He didn't look quite the same as he had on the bus, though. He was wearing more polished clothes, a casual yet expensive-looking jacket, and his hair was neatly styled now. But there was still something about him that felt familiar. It took me a second, but then I realized it was Ryan, the guy the first had helped the day before. I felt a bit embarrassed that I hadn't recognized him sooner, but he just smiled, his hazel eyes lighting up when he saw me. "It's you," I said, surprised, unable to keep the astonishment from my voice. Ryan chuckled, an easy laugh that seemed to put me at ease. "I told you I'd pay you back for the bus fare," he said with a playful glint in his eyes. I smiled back, shaking my head. "You didn't have to come all the way here for that. I wasn't expecting anything." "Well," he said, looking a little sheepish, "maybe I wanted good coffee too." That remark made me laugh. And suddenly, the tension in the air between us seemed to lift. It was like the world had shifted a little, and I didn't mind the idea of sharing a few minutes with him in the middle of my hectic day. "My name's Ryan," he added, as if it wasn't already obvious. I nodded, introducing myself in return, but before I could say anything more, my coworker Lisa nudged me. "We've got 6 people waiting for their drinks," she whispered urgently, her voice tight with impatience. "Right," I said quickly, turning back to the espresso machine. "Sorry about that," I called over my shoulder. Ryan gave me a small nod, watching me work with an interest that I couldn't quite place. There was something different about the way he looked at me, something that wasn't about the coffee or even the brief exchange we'd had the day before. It was as if he was trying to figure something out, like he was watching me through a lens that no one else used. As I finished serving drinks and the morning rush died down, I had a moment to glance over at Ryan, who had taken a seat by the window. He was reading a book, not on his phone like most people these days, and I couldn't help but admire how effortlessly cool he seemed. He wasn't pretending to be anything he wasn't. He was just himself. And something about that, in contrast to my own life of balancing school and work, made me feel like I was missing something. When the last of the customers left, I found myself walking over to Ryan's table, half embarrassed by how much time I had spent watching him without realizing it. "So, do you make a habit of forgetting your wallet?" I asked with a teasing smile as I wiped down the nearby table. Ryan laughed softly, a slightly guilty expression crossing his face. "Not usually. Yesterday was unusual." "How so?" I asked, intrigued. He seemed hesitant at first, looking down at his book for a moment, unsure whether to continue. "Well," he said slowly, "let's just say I'm trying something different with my life." His tone became more serious, more reflective, as if he was sharing something with me that he didn't often talk about. "Mysterious," I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Not intentionally. he added, a half-smile forming on his lips. There was something in his voice, an honesty that I hadn't expected. I had worked at Brood Awakening for long enough to know when someone was hiding something or trying to put up a facade. But with Ryan, it didn't feel like he was hiding. It was more like he was just figuring it out. You know, he continued after a beat. You're the first person who's done something nice for me without expecting anything in return. It felt real. I paused, surprised. It was just bus fare, I said, trying to brush it off. But his words had struck something deep inside me. I hadn't realized how much that simple act of kindness could mean to someone. I know, he said quietly, but it wasn't about the money. It was just the fact that you didn't expect anything. I felt my chest tighten as I processed his words. There was something about Ryan that felt different from anyone else I had met. He wasn't like the other guys who came in for their morning coffee, all rushing through their lives with their eyes glued to their phones. No, he was present, grounded in a way that was rare in a world full of distractions. And that's when I realized something profound. Ryan wasn't just trying to pay me back for bus fare. He was looking for something more, a connection that didn't have strings attached. A connection that didn't involve expectations or hidden agendas. I don't know what to say, I admitted. Ryan smiled, a little sheepishly, as if he was unsure of himself for the first time. How about coffee sometime, when you're not working? It took me a second. But before I could second-guess myself, I nodded. Sure, coffee sometime. We both smiled, a small moment of understanding passing between us. One that spoke volumes about where we might go from here. Little did I know, that simple agreement would lead to something that neither of us could have expected or prepared for. As I went back to work, I tried not to think too much about what had just happened. It seemed too easy, too natural, but as the day went on, I couldn't stop wondering about Ryan. Something about him had already started to feel important, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. What I did know was that this wasn't just some random encounter. It was the start of something I was unprepared for. Something that would change my life in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. It was a quiet morning when Ryan walked into Brood Awakening again. The familiar chime of the door was like a signal, ringing in my ears as I wiped down the counter. The coffee shop was a little less busy than usual, and I had just started making my first cup of the day when I saw him. My heart gave an involuntary flutter, but I pushed it down, pretending I hadn't noticed how he stood out even in the simplest clothes. Today, he wore a slightly more tailored jacket, a contrast to the casual vibe he had the first time we met. His posture, as always, was confident yet calm. Morning, he said, his voice steady as he approached the counter. Morning, I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the fact that something about him seemed to change with each encounter. As usual, we exchanged pleasantries, and I prepared his usual order, black coffee. No frills. He handed me the money, and for a moment, our fingers brushed as I took the change from his hand. I could feel the same warmth in his touch, that same unspoken connection, but there was something else in his eyes today. Something more guarded. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it made my chest tighten. Everything okay? I asked, keeping my tone light but with a hint of concern. Ryan hesitated, glancing down at his coffee before meeting my gaze. There was a flicker of something I couldn't read, but it quickly faded. Yeah, everything's fine, he said, a little too quickly. I didn't press. I didn't want to. Not yet, but I could tell something was off. His smile wasn't quite as easy as it used to be, and his eyes darted around the room, almost like he was looking for something, or someone. I told myself I was imagining it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. He took his coffee and found a table by the window. I kept an eye on him, noticing that he kept glancing up, his eyes meeting mine briefly before both of us would look away. As if we were both avoiding something. There was a tension between us, unspoken and thick, hanging in the air. Then, just as I thought I had imagined it all, it happened. A woman entered the shop. A journalist by the looks of her, sharp eyes, professional demeanor, and a press badge hanging around her neck. She scanned the room, and when her gaze landed on Ryan, her face lit up with recognition. Ethan Carter, she called out, her voice sharp, almost accusatory. I froze. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan Carter? The heir to the Carter Grand Hotel's empire? I glanced at Ryan, who now looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face was pale, his usual calm demeanor crumbling into something I couldn't quite place. The journalist walked over to him with purpose, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. Ethan, what are you doing here? She asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and condescension. Slumming it in a coffee shop? Ryan, or Ethan, I realized now, looked like he wanted to disappear. He opened his mouth to speak, but the woman was already pulling out her phone, snapping photos of him before he could protest. Is this a publicity stunt? Trying to be a regular guy for a change? The words stung, and I felt my heart sink as I processed what was happening. I had been duped. The man I had been talking to, the one I had shared coffee with, was not who he had said he was. He was a billionaire's son. Someone with wealth and privilege beyond my wildest imagination. The very thing I had been working so hard to escape, pretensions, expectations, was all tied up in the man sitting in front of me. Ethan, I began, but my voice faltered. The journalist was already typing furiously into her phone, a triumphant smile on her lips. Hotel heir Ethan Carter spotted at local coffee shop, new life or just a game? I couldn't breathe. The cafe felt too small, suffocating. The sounds of the customers talking around me seemed distant as I turned to face Ryan. His expression had collapsed, guilt and panic flashing across his face. The man I had been talking to, the man who had seemed so genuine, was nothing like the person I thought he was. Sophie, he said my name, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached toward me, but I stepped back instinctively. Ethan, I couldn't finish the sentence. My heart was in my throat, and my mind was racing. Was any of it real? Were we just part of some game for him? Something to entertain himself with while playing the part of a regular person? Before I could say another word, Lisa, my coworker, came over. Her arms were crossed, and her eyes were narrowed. Sophie, is everything okay? She asked, glancing at Ethan, her expression suddenly sharp with realization. You knew? No, I said, shaking my head. I didn't know. Lisa looked at Ethan with disgust. So that's why you've been tipping so generously, she muttered, her voice cold. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I barely registered Ethan's words as he reached for my hand. Sophie, please, let me explain. I couldn't look at him. You lied to me, Ethan, for weeks. You never told me the truth about who you were. My voice cracked, and I felt the burn of tears behind my eyes. I wasn't just hurt, I was humiliated. Everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. Everything. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to tell you, he said, his voice desperate now. I just wanted to be seen for who I am, not who I'm expected to be. Who are you? I asked, my voice hollow. Who are you really? Before he could answer, Lisa appeared from behind the counter. Sensing the tension. Everything okay, Sophie? She asked, her voice softer now. I need a break, I said, barely holding it together as I unceremoniously took off my apron and walked to the staff room. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's voice, faint and pleading. Please, Sophie, don't go, let me explain. But I couldn't listen anymore. My head was spinning, the humiliation burned, and the tears finally spilled as I sat in the staff room, trying to understand what had just happened. Ryan, no, Ethan, wasn't just a regular guy. And I was the fool who had fallen for it. The next few days were a blur. The moment at the coffee shop played in my mind over and over again. Each time the pain of betrayal feeling sharper, more real. I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face as the journalist had exposed him. The mask I had thought he wore had been stripped away in an instant, revealing a truth I had never seen coming. And yet, amid the anger and confusion, a part of me missed him. Missed the version of him I had known. The version that seemed genuine. like he was trying to find something real in a world full of facades. I threw myself into work and school, trying to drown out the ache in my chest. But each time I walked past a familiar coffee shop table or looked at my phone, I couldn't help but wonder, was he really the same person who had shared coffee with me? Who had listened to me talk about my life? My struggles? It had been a week since the incident, and I hadn't heard from Ethan. I assumed he was as embarrassed as I was. The shame I felt was suffocating. I had let him in. I had shared things with him that I hadn't shared with anyone else in years. Now, all I could think about was how stupid I had been to let someone like him into my life. But then, one morning, something unexpected happened. As I was about to head out for my shift, I received a text. The message was simple, but it made my heart skip a beat. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know how to tell you the truth. Can we meet? I need to explain." I stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of his words heavy in my chest. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and never think about him again. But another part, the part that had started to question whether I had misjudged him, wanted to hear him out. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was just a way to hold on to something I had once believed in. But I couldn't shake the curiosity, the need for closure, for understanding. So, I agreed. We decided to meet at a small park near my apartment. The morning was chilly, the autumn air crisp against my skin as I walked to the bench where we had agreed to meet. I had no idea what to expect. Would he be the same confident man I had known? Or would he be different now that the truth had come out? Would he even show up? As I sat there, waiting, I found myself lost in thought. I wondered if I was making a mistake. What if his apology was just another part of his act? But then I remembered something he had said once, the words about how, when we first met, I was the first person who hadn't looked at him and seen just the name or the money. I had seen him, and he had seen me. The sound of footsteps broke me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see Ethan walking toward me. He was dressed simply, in a worn jacket and jeans, and his face looked older somehow, like he had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. When he saw me, his expression softened, and he approached slowly, as though unsure of how to proceed. "Sophie," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm glad you came." I didn't answer right away. Part of me still wanted to walk away, to run back into my life where things made sense, where everything wasn't complicated by lies and truths I didn't understand. But another part of me, maybe the part that still saw the person I had gotten to know in the coffee shop, wanted to hear him out. "Ryan," I said, using his real name for the first time since I'd learned the truth. It felt strange on my lips, but it also felt like something I needed to do. "I don't know what to think. You lied to me. You didn't tell me who you really were." "I know," he replied, his voice thick with regret. "And I hate myself for it. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to be the person my family expected me to be. I just wanted to be me. But I didn't know how to make that happen without losing you." I looked at him, unsure of how to feel. There was sincerity in his eyes, a raw honesty that hadn't been there before. For the first time, I saw the real Ryan, or rather, the real Ethan, the man behind the name. The person who had been struggling to find his place in a world that had been handed to him on a silver platter. "I wanted to be the person you saw, Sophie," he continued, stepping a little closer. "But I didn't know how to live without the mask. And I'm sorry for that." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said before. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet for a moment, processing everything. Did I believe him? Did I want to believe him? "I don't know what to say," I admitted finally. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can trust you again." Ethan nodded, his face falling. "I understand. I've destroyed that trust. But all I'm asking for is a chance to rebuild it. A chance to prove that I can be the person you thought I was. Not the person everyone expected me to be, but the person I want to be. For myself. And for you." I let his words sink in, taking a deep breath as I looked at him. For the first time, I saw someone who was truly vulnerable. Someone who had made mistakes but was genuinely trying to make things right. I don't know if we can just pick up where we left off, I said softly, but I'm willing to try. I don't want to let this be the end of everything. Ethan smiled, a small, cautious smile that made my heart ache a little. I'll take that, he said. That's all I need, a chance to show you the real me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were starting over, slowly, carefully, but at least we were starting. And that was enough for me, for now. As time went on, Ethan and I took small, careful steps towards rebuilding the trust that had been broken. Our conversations, once filled with uncertainty and misunderstandings, slowly transformed into moments of vulnerability, where we shared more of ourselves than we ever had before. We began to meet more often, each time learning something new about each other, building something genuine from the ground up. We still had our challenges. Trust, once broken, takes time to heal, and there were days when doubts crept in. But we were patient, with each other and with ourselves. I watched Ethan navigate a world far removed from the one he had known. And in return, he saw me fight to make my dreams come true. Even when life felt overwhelming. It wasn't a perfect story. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand reconciliations, but there was honesty, and that was more than I had ever hoped for. Our connection, forged in a moment of simple kindness, grew stronger each day. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about learning from it and choosing to move forward together. One day, as we sat together in a quiet cafe, I realized that life had led us here, not through grand plans or carefully laid out paths, but through small choices, quiet moments, and the courage to take risks on something real. And so, as I stepped into the future with Ethan by my side, I knew that sometimes, the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest gestures, like offering spare change to a stranger on a bus. If you've enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and share it. Subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming life stories that remind us how small acts of kindness can change everything. Stay tuned for the next one.